Welcome to the third season of Heard Afros and Audio interview series. My guest today is Shannon Cason. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. Feeling good.
Man, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. I want to tell this story first, if you don't mind, man.
No, I'm all
Um,
ears.
my first time meeting you was before Afros and Audio ever started. It was before the first conference. It was me reaching out to people in New York because that's where I was located at the time, trying to build community, let people know that this is what I'm about to do. I'm out here. And so I met Lee.
Oh, yeah, Lee.
Yeah,
Yeah, good
yeah,
people.
yes, yes,
Yeah, she was just out here
absolutely.
not too long ago. Yeah, House of
hmm
NYC.
There you go. And I met up with her, and we had a quick phone conversation. And I think a week after that conversation, she said, "I'm going to an event, and why don't you come with me?" So I'm like, "Sure, I'm open to it because I'm looking to meet more people and really get people understanding what Afros and Audio was all about and why I'm doing this." And so the first event ever was at B&H, where you were
Oh,
the featured
yeah.
storyteller. And so it was one of those things where it solidified, this is really the space I want to be in, because the story you told was about your father's Cadillac. So this was 2018, man.
That's
And
that's what's up. That
yeah,
event at B&H, we had some power players in the room then. You was there, and another friend of mine was there. She's like a publisher at Disney. Lee was there. So it was a lot of people there. It was pretty cool.
yeah, man. And it was my first podcast industry event that I went to. And like I said, it affirmed my belief in the fact that we're out here, we're laying down this record, we're telling our stories, and podcasting is so important for our future as a people, as a community, and as oral storytellers. And you were the first, man, and I really appreciate you.
Man, that mean a lot to me hearing that. Yeah, Megan Tan, she was there. That is Samson, and you work
Yep.
with Samson now, so that's
Yeah.
cool.
Yep. I do.
Nah, that's
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to tell that story. I definitely wanted to give you your flowers, man, for all that you have been doing as an oral storyteller in your podcast. And you've been doing this for a minute, and we're going to get into that. Homemade Stories, that's the name of your podcast.
yep.
And a long running podcast known for its brutally honest storytelling. What inspired you to start the show, and how has your approach to storytelling evolved over the years?
How I started podcasting was in those little beginning stages. It probably had been around for a few years, but it was like the beginning stages of people really starting to listen to them. So I had started writing. I was out of work for a time, and I started writing these short stories, just going off of childhood dreams and things, writing these short little fictional stories. And when podcasting was taking off, I listened to the New Yorker fiction podcast because I like writing and I like reading. And I was listening to Mark Maron's podcast was one of the earlier podcasts that kind of took off. And I was like, I can do this because I had some experience in hip hop. I used to produce music, myself in Detroit. So I used those skills. It was like, I'm going to create a podcast. And that's when I started Homemade Stories, just to tell my own stories, like the New Yorker fiction, but also add in some of my regular life, like Mark Maron. So it was like the end of
Wow.
2009, the beginning of 2010, and I started that from there, and I just kept it going, and how it evolved was just with the evolution of podcasting. So podcasting took off a little bit more where the radio stations started paying attention, and I was living in Chicago at the time, so WBEZ Chicago is the public radio station out there, and they started paying attention to podcasting, and I was one of the podcasts that was in the Chicago area, and I connected with them and started working with the Moth. The Moth was really a switch over to do more of the personal narrative storytelling because I was doing a lot of fiction early on, but then with the Moth, it's more personal narrative, and they had a radio show. So I saw opportunity there, and I started telling my own stories, which I had some interesting stories as well. And that's where it went from there, and I just evolved over the years.
Nice, man. And listening to your podcast, you typically are in that 15 minutes and under, you in and out. You tell the story and you move it forward. How did you come up with the format and how you were going to present these stories through podcasting?
Yeah, I'm a student of certain literature and music and just great voices. So one of the voices was KRS-One, and he said
Mm.
music had to have a mood. He wanted to have a mood to his song. So like you listen to Step Into This World, it immediately put me in a mood when I hear certain songs. My philosophy immediately put me in a mood. I come from the kind of hip hop music background, so I wanted all my podcast episodes to be, in my mind, like songs, and songs are like 4 minutes, 3 minutes. So a shorter podcast around 15 minutes, under 20 minutes. And that was my big idea because you can hold a mood for 15 minutes or so. The other thing was I'm a big fan of Elmore Leonard, who is a crime author out of Detroit. So he wrote a lot of Detroit crime fiction, and he always said, "Write the part that people wanna read. Try not to write the part
Mm.
that people don't like to read." So I tried to keep a lot of fluff out of my podcast because I don't like that when I'm listening to podcasts. I keep the fluff at certain points, like at the end. And people who wanna listen to it, they can listen to it, but then people who don't, they can just get the story and run. So
Yeah.
that's always been my philosophy. Have a good mood, but also, what would I wanna hear?
Yeah. Yeah.
From my mindset.
Yeah. Well, that's important, man. I appreciate that. And I've talked to a lot of podcasters who come from the music world. And I want so much for more folks in the music world to understand how valuable podcasting
Yeah,
is. And not only from the mic, but also behind the scenes, the producers and stuff like
man,
that.
man.
It's here.
There's so many people
Hmm.
with incredible talent. Like, I'm one of the mid-level talents on the music side. You get what I'm saying? Like, interview
Yeah.
people, I'll be around just amazed by them. I come from that whole Jay Dilla and Eminem and that type of
Yeah.
era, so you'll look at these producers and DJs and the people that you know, and you're like, "You're an amazing talent." But now, a lot of them are learning about
Yeah, they are.
podcasting. They're
Hmm.
on Discord. They're on all these other things as well. So now a lot of people know, but I know 7 to 10 years ago, I would be trying to tell people, "Hey, man, look at this podcasting thing. This is something here. You can bring those talents over on the podcasting side."
Yeah. We're getting there, man, for sure. So you've worked with platforms like the Moth and Snap Judgment. How have those experiences shaped your storytelling techniques and podcasting journey?
The thing is, I look at people who's successful and I incorporate a lot of it and I get feedback. So I've always been one of those people who've been open to feedback. I feel like feedback make me better. I've never been one to close myself off from that. So with the Moth and Snap Judgment, I always received good feedback on my storytelling, but I also learned a lot about structuring. So
Hmm.
working with WBZ, they would structure the stories in a certain way for the radio because they have to fit in a certain time slot. So watching all those things throughout the years, I learned them to be able to take on to business opportunities where I may create podcasts for nonprofits or for different projects, techniques and things that I learned to also teach workshops and go on to do other things. But the thing is, those places are successful at it and they've been doing it for a long time. So I try to pick up and glean some of that knowledge from whoever I work with. And I pass it along too. That's one of the things as well within this process is just passing it along, like being a conduit for the next person coming up.
And I love us talking about technique because it's so important. A lot of people be out here just willy nilly,
Yeah.
if I may, just doing anything, and that's fine.
Sometimes it
But
works.
you know,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Depends.
sometimes it
Yeah.
works. But structure and technique, I always think about technique as when Kimbo Slice, rest in power to him, when he was in the street fights. But the moment he stepped on that arena and he was matched up with people who had technique, it was a different ball
He
game.
had to pick
You
it up.
know,
He had to change his game.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Being willing to learn, like you said, and understand the success strategies that go into anything that we do is so important. I just wanted to amplify that because there are people out here who are aspiring and new and or seasoned and they're wondering why. Learn.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you always gotta be open. I've seen people who close themselves off, like they'll be offended by feedback. You can't be offended by it. Feedback don't mean you always have to accept it. You may be venturing into a new lane that nobody has seen yet, and it may be very popular as you perfect it, but there's nothing wrong with feedback. It doesn't mean you have to take
Yeah.
it, but I've used feedback for my success many times and working with bigger organizations, also being a guest on shows like the Moth and Snap Judgment. I remember I was getting like probably 700 downloads or whatever episode, and then I appeared on Snap Judgment, and it immediately went up to 10,000 the next episode I dropped. And
Yeah.
for that month, it was astronomical change. Go on new shows and learn, and really it can help you grow.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about that. And it's not like it's overnight. There is no overnight. You've been doing the work, but then you go on a show and it changes over 10,000 listeners. How did that feel that when you first saw this number?
Yeah, I'm gonna be real with you, man. I felt like my stuff should have been getting more listens anyway. Cause I was like,
Yeah.
Man, these stories are good. Cause I was doing them from the sense of I like them. And
Hmm.
I know my taste is good because I come from good stock. So I'm like, I like this. More people gotta like this. So when I go on a show like Snap Judgment, and I remember I was sitting because I was doing a lot of stage work. So I'm working with
Hmm.
doing their stage show, but I'm kind of introverted and I never told them that I have a podcast myself.
Mm.
My podcast is actually older than Snap Judgment, but I never told him. So I
Yeah.
said, "Hey, Glenn, next time you put me on the radio, can y'all mention my podcast?" He was like, "No, you had a podcast?" And then he mentioned it. And then I saw an explosion in the growth. And then people, even now, they'll find me through the Moth or Snap Judgment. They'll say, "Oh, I listened to you
Yeah.
on the Moth, and I didn't know you had your podcast until they said it." That had always been a thing. Like, I was like, man, the people who like these stories, they're going to like my podcast. But it was
Yeah.
just that this
Yeah.
discoverability came from being on similar, larger podcasts.
Yeah, yeah, and it brings up the importance of expansion, right? Being open to getting on these larger stages, but it's got to be intentional on your part
Yeah,
to actually seek out those other experiences that can bring people back to you. Everything's a touch point. And once they discover you, now they want to binge you.
yeah,
And so that's something really important for creatives to understand that anything that you put out here, from your stories that you may have written down to the podcast to your live experiences, once people find you, now they want to find everything that you've done.
yeah. I'm the same
Yeah.
way. I find something I like and I just saturate myself in it. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
appreciate that.
word. So over the years, you built a community of listeners called the Friends of Homemade. How have relationships influenced your podcasting journey?
Podcasting is so intimate. And I didn't know that until I got more listeners joining the feed. What had happened was I just didn't know. It's been like actual friendships and relationships that's come through the podcast. And I'm pretty accessible. Like, I give my email out and people can contact me on social media and I respond. So I've been to people's homes. I've gone on trips with people, dinners and friendships and going to shows together. So it's become that kind of community. But I think I base it in that sense too. I always looked at like the church in different churches I would go to. We would go to Trinity in Chicago, popular church, Reverend Wright's church when we were going there, the Obama's pastor at that time.
All
So
right,
we
all
would
right.
go, but I would always watch how he would do certain things. He would always mention people in the pews, like the Jefferson's kids. He going to Harvard next week, and right here he going to Jackson State. He would shout out people in the pews, and he would talk to people while he was doing his sermon, like almost like he's talking to that actual person. So I watched
Hmm.
that with
Hmm.
different pastors and learned that over the time. And I do the same thing on my podcast. Like, I'll be in the middle of doing an episode and I'll just mention somebody who I know listens. So I
Yeah.
always had that kind of friendly correspondence with my listeners in the sense, and they'll write me and it's almost like we're talking. So Friends of Homemade, it went along with it. And then branching into the Patreon and also other more structured ways where we can continue the conversation.
There's a lot to be learned from some good Black pastors, man. I call it masterpiece theater, man. They are upholding that oral tradition, that storytelling in such a
100%.
theatrical way. Yeah, yeah. And so
100%.
there's so many aspects of our own culture that we bring to this microphone.
Yeah.
which makes it that much more important for us to continue this and more of us get into the space. So yeah, man, I appreciate you shouting that out. What has been the most rewarding interaction you received from your listeners, and why does it stand out to you?
I'm going a different direction with this is,
Okay.
your relationships that you make, they're genuine. And these are real people that you learn and you get to know. And it's when you lose certain people. I think about that in some of the episodes. I'm like, man, and I see emails, like I was going through my emails the other day, just situating things. And I'm like, wow, they're not here anymore. And those kind of feelings, but you had those special times together where you may have gone out to Portland and visited. One lady was Kim Brias. We became like this. Anytime I did a campaign or anything, she'll push me over the edge. I went and visited her family and we did storytelling shows in her living room. And then her family to contact me and that she's not here anymore. And
Mhm.
that's not the only one, it's others. But you'll go through these experiences, good and bad, with families and listeners, and I call them friends, the friends of Homemade
Yeah.
Stories. I think that connection is the most rewarding thing, that it's a real connection. It's a genuine connection, and you wanna continue it on because so many people believe in the show and in the, podcast.
Yeah. And the importance of a lot of times when people are heard, they're creating art, they're being seen out in the world and essentially become a public figure, people think they know you just based off of what they say.
Yeah, no doubt.
And so it makes those connections, those people who want to go beyond that and say, I really want to get to know you and who you are and why you are. I agree 100%, man. It's those connections that are so meaningful. And we get to be in pursuit of those. Again, the intentionality of it all. Because when they say it's lonely at the top, sometimes because you left me at the top, you thought I didn't need you no more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's real important, man. I appreciate you saying that. You consult for companies, nonprofits, and even pro athletes and celebrities. How do you adapt your storytelling techniques to different audiences and industries?
The biggest thing is thinking about who I'm working with. So a lot of times we'll project ourselves onto everything, but instead of doing that, really coming from their side and thinking about it from aligning the storytelling to their vision, their mission. A big part is finding out what's the intention. So
Mhm,
if a nonprofit is creating a podcast, what is the intention of this podcast? Is it to get 1,000,000 listeners? And many times that's not it. The intention is to build community, or it might be even a small group. It's not necessarily like this huge audience that we want to reach. We just want to reach this audience, or we want to build more fundraising, or we want to let our fundraisers and our funders know what's happening and what we're doing in the community. And that could be part of their intention. So
mhm.
it's sometimes finding out the intention and then building on that and looking at it from that side of just fitting their mission and what their purpose and what they need most. So one of the people from the Moth reached out and said, "Hey Shannon, I think you'd be a good opportunity to work with Uninterrupted, which is a sports company with LeBron James and Maverick Carter, and working with them for a time frame to talk to athletes and work on different things, and then them passing me on to somebody else to be able to work with Spotify." And my friend Dawn Frazier, she have big projects that she might be working with Google and these larger companies, and she needs help. So being competent in a way for storytelling, podcasting, and then also to be able to work with workshops, you're competent. So people are going to grab you and pull you in and bring you as a part of these projects because they know you can do the work and people are going to have a good experience from it. So those have been my experiences with consulting, and it continues on. Right now, I've been doing a more of a push to do more of it. It's just all part of the journey.
Yeah, and it all came from podcasting. And that's just so important for people to understand and why I love podcasting so much is I think it's a cornerstone of our creativity, our work as individuals that so much more can be built off of. The relationships, business opportunities, being able to go further and expand the work. I think is so important that this audio becomes that cornerstone. And so for you, the reason why we're doing this is you are a possibility in so many ways. for others who are looking to do similar things. But I can imagine that when you first started, you didn't see half the things that came your way as a result of you starting.
Yeah, and I think you brought it up earlier, like that expansive vision with the things. So in starting a podcast, you do have to think of it in that way because some people aren't going to find an audio podcast. So you have to be able to have expansive thinking. Can this move to video or is there a video component of this? How do I get more people to the audio, which for me was going on bigger shows? The education and learning that I'm getting through working with the Moth, Snap Judgment, WBZ, WDET, all these different radio stations, I'm learning something that a lot of places don't know. Maybe I can use that education for other things. And then when podcasting, even now, people don't really know what to do and how to start it. Like
Mhm.
if a company or organization, they want to start a podcast, they don't even know who to go to. There's podcast companies, but many times they aren't suited for everybody, situations as well, and finding the right provider because many times it's a podcast provider who may be into wild chat casts, but that's
Mhm,
not
mhm.
what a nonprofit foundation wants. So you
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
find the place that kind of fits their focus and their personality.
yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So, for podcasters, your advice is to extend themselves to other shows. What are some practical steps creators can take to foster these connections and collaborations?
Pitch. I would say always pitch because when you think about these weekly radio shows, podcasts, and YouTube shows, they have to come up with ideas every week, sometimes twice a week, sometimes daily.
Mhm.
If you pitch and get turned down, don't be offended. Pitch again and continue to pitch. A door is going to open because the thing is, it's an ever growing thing. Is they gonna have to come up with new content, and if you're available and you got the right story at the right time, you in. You're on This American Life. You're on whatever is the most popular podcast or YouTube. You can get in that way. So I would say be relentless in that way, but also be genuine. A lot of times with radio and podcasts, they can tell disingenuous motives that you just want to push your initiative or your programs. So the one thing is be genuine in that you want the best experience for the audience. So that's what I would say, pitch, always be pitching.
Yeah, yeah, and that's important for people to understand because people say they want more and do nothing to get the more.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I know.
yeah. They do nothing to get the more, and this is why I do work around self-image and mindset. We've got so much socialized beliefs around ourselves, and the minute we hear a no, we're back in our shell. We're back in, well, I guess it's not enough, or I'm not enough. And it's something that you said earlier. We got to believe in the stuff that we're putting out first. That's got to be the foundation of everything. And then we move it forward. Because if you can be shook by a no, then maybe you're not ready to be out in the space. You got to believe in your shit
That's
first.
good. No, that's good.
Yeah.
That's real good. Yeah. You do have to know you got it in some ways. And I
Yeah.
even say that before I go on stage. I'll say that to myself. I'll say, I got a word for this time right now. Somebody needs to hear what I'm delivering. I have to have that intention. If I don't have that intention, then the fear and those thoughts that you're not enough and nobody wants to hear what you have to say come to mind and they want to talk in the back of my head. But if I know I have an intention, and if it's just one person who needs to hear this message, and usually it's a lot more than one. But the thing is, that'll break down all that stage fright, all the fear, and kind of push that away. And I gotta do
Yeah.
it and make it more mission oriented than just I want it to sound cool and to be
Yeah. Yeah.
popular.
Yeah.
If I really have an intention with this, then I know, okay, I got to do it because somebody needs to hear this message. Somebody needs to hear the message of a relationship that turned around. Somebody needs to hear the message of a friendship that I had to walk away from because it was toxic. Someone needs to hear the message of compulsive behaviors and getting control over them and those kind of things. That
Yeah.
pushes me beyond that don't put it out because it's important that I put it out. It's bigger than just me.
Yeah, man. I have a philosophy, man. The things that make us great aren't really about us. It's for everybody else that is waiting for you to show up and be there in that space. So again, they can come out the shadows or they can have a revelation or be disrupted in the thoughts that they have. It's just not about us in a lot of ways. And so once we're able to move out the way and show up for not just others, but for ourselves, because every time you step on that stage, you're showing up for self. You're showing up for that little boy that may not have thought that the stories mattered or they mattered.
Yeah.
So you're spot on. And that's what I appreciate so much about us as creators who show up, just show up because it is so important. What advice would you give to podcasters looking to build meaningful connections within podcasting?
Connect. Be a part of Afro and Audios. I joined the Facebook and I'm active in the social media. Even this conversation here, I saw it in the newsletter and I signed up for it. So be active in that way because that's going to bring more people to you and you're making yourself open to opportunities. They have podcast movement where we met at before, just reaching out to other podcasters as well. I have people reach out to me all the time and I reach out to others all the time too and connect within my own community as well. So knowing the podcasters here in the area, Q Lewis and
Shout out to Q.
yeah. And this other podcast in this area, they call it Audio Wave. They do great work in the Detroit area. And there's so many other ones with WDT and then the other friends who are starting podcasts and sharing information and being honest. Like I like to be honest
Yeah.
about information as well. I've helped a lot of people, but then I've felt sometimes when I'm trying to get information from somebody and they're holding the keys, I'm asking them what I should charge somebody and they charge them whatever you think is good. And I'm like, I don't want to say 500 when I could say 50,000.
Yeah.
Help
Word
me
up.
out.
Word up.
So I help people out in that way to make sense for them because I think that's what I appreciate. So I try to share that with other people as well. It mean the world to
Yeah.
me when you say even me working with Samson for that B&H program that you were there. That means a lot to me because I think that's a part of that whole pass it along thing. Not that I passed anything along, but you just saw me doing it and then you doing it as well. And then watching what Afros and audio has become over these years. I'm like, wow, but at the same time, you building that community and continue to be consistent with it. So I love it.
Yeah, man. I appreciate that. So as an audio professional, because you're not just a podcast creator and a host, you're also doing the producing. What are some storytelling elements or techniques you believe every podcast should consider?
As far as analytic wise, like I said earlier, talked about intention of the podcast. So sometimes it could be a show that's for a financial company and it has 100 listens, but those 100 listens are the clients. They might have brought in 3 new clients from the podcast that's going for a year. But those 3 new clients equal $10 million of new revenue that came into the company. So really being keen on what's the intention of the show that I'm creating, because I have a financial client that just reached out to me recently. So those things are important. Even the intention of each episode. Like a lot of times people are just churning out episodes, and that's important to be consistent, but having a reason for the episode. I think a lot of times people are just doing this fast and it has to be consistent, and they just throw quality and content just out of the window. So I agree with the consistency and not being a perfectionist, but I think you can do more just by having intention. And that doesn't mean in perfectionism. That just means it's a reason for the show, not just doing it. And I'm just going to talk about nothing just to have an
Yeah.
episode there. But if you even have smallest intention, have some kind of reason for that episode.
Yeah. And just like you were talking about the pitches and how people can tell when it's disingenuous, as we know, podcasting is so intimate because your listeners are choosing you. They're choosing to listen to you. There's a lot that they could choose from, but they chose you and they rely on you and jumping in there with things that they're like, what is this and why? People can tell.
Yeah.
So
And all these
it is
can tell
important.
that
This
you
is
care. Yep.
Yeah, this is creative work, man. This is just as creative and valuable as taking the time to read a book. And for you being a storyteller, I can imagine one of the goals is that people feel like they riding right with you. When I sat in that audience and you talked about the Cadillac, I could see it. I could see it vividly because of your intent in telling the story and adding in those elements that would allow me to be right there with you in that space and time. And so it is important. There's a lot of podcasts out here, and I don't knock any of them because I do think that you're going to evolve if you're
Yeah.
serious. It might start a certain way and you're going to evolve. But the importance of really understanding the value of the work that you put out is really important.
No, I agree 100% with what you're saying. And that means the world too, that a story from I don't know how many years ago, but that stuck still in your head. And that's one of the things of mastering your craft, whatever that craft is. I do storytelling, but saturate yourself, in whatever that craft is that you're working on. Like you do events and other things as well, but you do events. I'm sure Afros and Audios has leveled up each time, and I've watched it, how it
Absolutely.
has. So just mastering your craft, and that's one of the things with storytelling. Like for me, those are like the ribbons on my sleeve when I hear, I remember your story because I crafted
Hmm.
it to be remembered. Even when I'm working with people on storytelling, I'm telling them to use active voice, put action in the story, show certain scenes and action and vivid details, and not so much just a bunch of adjectives, but really one of the biggest things I keep going to it is intention. So, like the pastors will say, I'm talking to the pews and parishioners out of an anointing, and that's different from just I'm just going up to give a speech. But I really want you to take something away with you. My storytellers that I work with, I tell them to end heavy. And by end heavy, I give them something to put in their pocket and take home and think about later on and go back to and say, what did he mean by that? I like TV
Yeah.
shows with Easter eggs where you leave little details that may need to be ruminated on. And so those are the things that I like to do even in the podcast.
Yeah, man. And listening to stories, it connects us also to our own experiences. And your story put me in my uncle's car where he still had the 8 track and pushing them and listening
I
to
agree.
you know, you know, Run DMC and the Beastie Boys and all that sort of thing, and being young and the music making me feel alive. But what was also happening was I was sitting in this hot ass car and I'm right back there where the engine's not on or anything. It might not even be moving, but I'm there. I'm in that space and
No
time.
doubt.
And how important that is for us as consumers of the stories, but also you're connecting back to a time as well for yourself.
Yeah, yeah. I love
Yeah.
it. That's what audio does for us. I make connections with great podcasts just listening to them. And then the video podcast now that a lot of people are creating, I'm a big fan of those and I'm watching a lot of stuff. So I enjoy the whole industry.
Yeah, me too, man. And it's not even where it's going because even what you do, there's a lot of storytelling podcasts out there, but each of them are very unique. And I think as podcasting evolves, so will the stories become more expansive because we've lived a life. I'm not a spring chicken and I got mad stories to tell.
I know you do stories
Yeah,
too. I
yeah,
remember those
yeah,
early talks.
for sure. So you work with a wide range of audio projects, as you mentioned. So, how do you maintain the creativity and authenticity across the different platforms and genres? How do you keep that momentum even for yourself?
I journal. So I keep a notebook and then I stay interested. And you talked about expansive. I moved from just podcasts to other things as well. I read books. You see some books behind me, but they're not all like podcast books. I read literature, watch TV. We brought up church. I connect sermons to stories. Everything can be a story in so many ways. Like everyday life
Hmm.
is a story in so many ways. So I'll learn through those things. And with the notes and the journaling, is where I'll go to when I'm looking for new ideas and new stories because this is infinite. It'll never run out.
Yeah,
I don't have a story. Eh, Now we even got Chat GPT. If you you
yeah.
ran out of
If you need
ideas,
a
you can
story.
put in, give me 10
Yeah,
ideas on this. shoot out 10 ideas and some must spark from those ideas. But also, I reuse things as well. So many of the stories that I've told on the Moth or Snap Judgment, they were first Homemade Stories podcasts, but I re-edited to work with the Moth or Risk or Snap Judgment or radio stations or different stage shows. I just did a Moth Grand Slam just recently, but it was an old
Nice.
story from
Congratulations.
I
All right.
appreciate it from way back when. I just was like, oh, I can use this story. So I'll retell or refashion things for different environments as well, because a lot of the old material that you have from 10, 15 years ago, that stuff is still good. Just redo
Yep.
it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And not everyone has heard it. A lot of times as creators, and especially for podcasts, we've learned a lot from articles. There's a lot of noise out there, but also someone else's experience. But there's this opportunity for you to discover yourself inside of this. And knowing that I put this down in the podcast 2 years ago, even a month ago, and I can't use it again. What you mean? You know,
Yeah.
not everyone heard that story. You still have an opportunity to use it at other places. You made me curious about your storytelling structure. Do you craft a script for yourself? Do you go off the dome? How do you do your stories where they feel like you're telling them right then and there?
Well, it's changed over the years. Earlier, when it was the audio podcast, I would read a script, but I wouldn't read it like direct. It would be more of a loose reading to keep the intimate and the comfortable feel of conversation. I write conversationally, so it works that way. Now I use a teleprompter to keep me in the right direction. And that teleprompter, uh, it won't be like read directly just like I used to read the script, but keeping me on topic and keeping me in the direction I want to go. Going back to when I'm creating the stories, I'll use an outline and I'll use a basic structure for that. I usually try to I call it start violently, start provocatively, start sexy, start strong, because that's what's going to get people's attention, those first few
Yep.
words. So I start in a way that's really go catch you. Like I'm working on a story right now, and I started, is it a cult? A Homemade Stories listener invited me on a spiritual retreat, but my first thought was, is this a cult? So that kind of
Yeah.
gets the listener interested right away. Okay, we're talking about cults. So then I'll go into my story and I call it Make Music. Like my first act, I wanted it to be musical. I want you to know exactly what you can expect from my style of storytelling. And in that second act, it's going to be love and war, build up some tension, many high stakes, try to get you fall in love with the characters. And in the third act, I'm going to change, damn it. Stories require change. You listen to somebody's story and they never change. I can watch a movie and my daughter gets sick of me because I'll watch a movie and I'll look at the person and I'll be like, watch, they go solve the show at the end. Or she'll be like, even if she saw a show the other day, we was watching, I think the Squid Games. And in the early part, I was like, I don't trust that boat captain. Something about him. So my daughter was like, I don't think nothing, because she had watched it already, and she was like, "How you know the
Yeah.
boat
Yeah.
captain?" I was like, "I could just tell from the wording or the sentence he said right there." So those little
Yeah.
details, but you gotta change within the story at some point, and that's what I do in my third act. And then I already mentioned, like, my outro, I end heavy. So I wanna end in a way to keep that listener or the audience member thinking about that story afterwards. So I want them still ruminating in their mind for the next few days about it. I wanted them to keep it in mind. So I had
Right
different
on.
structures and different techniques that I use to tell stories and also for the podcast.
At this point, I think it's fair to say that you are a master storyteller, and just go ahead and accept it. We don't need to talk about it.
You funny, man. You funny. I
Yeah, man.
appreciate
So,
you always, man.
for sure, man. Just to wrap this up, man. Looking ahead, what are your goals for Homemade Stories and the newsletter, workshops, all these things that you have going on? What's the future hold for you?
With me right now, system. That's the biggest thing that I'm working on. Even me sharing right there, one of the structures of stories that I use, just systematizing everything. So I'm going through a lot of things and dissecting what I do so I can systematize it for others so they can be able to use it, but also I can be able to share it with others. So systematizing my podcast as well. So I'm coming out on a consistent basis, not just inconsistent basis as Homemade Stories has been, because I'd be working on other projects. But with
Mhm.
systems, I can keep it going on a regular basis. And then also to be able to do workshops. So a workshop for the storytelling, possibly doing something with the podcasting, but also some of my creative work with the books and writing and those kind of things. So it's all in stages, but at the same time, moving towards those directions by using clear systems for myself to make sense
Uh,
instead of just pulling
for
out my
sure.
hair as I'm working on projects. And because a lot of times homemade stories would take a backseat to money making projects, which makes sense. But same
Yeah.
time, I still want to keep that going because that's what brings them in the door. The podcast
Mhm.
brings them in the door. So if I let that drop when I'm done with the project, I'm like, oh, I got to pick back up this to get it going so somebody else want to work for the new
Yeah, yeah.
project. But it'd be better to just keep it going consistently.
Yeah, for sure. It's being always in that process of improvement. You could say, I've done this, it's been good, people have heard me. Sometimes I'm like, I'm very clear that this might look like 100%, but I gave this 45. So what if I put 100% to this?
Yeah.
What if I improved a bit? And it's important to have that level of awareness around the work because at the end of the day, it's still you and more than anybody that's experiencing it.
No doubt.
So if you had a CTA, a call to action for anyone that's listening, how we can support and or rally around or push anything for you, what would it be right now?
Definitely listen to Homemade Stories. Go to Shannon Cason's Homemade on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, also on YouTube. Subscribe to the YouTube. I think that's going to be the next area I'm learning. So I'm learning how the
Yeah.
algorithm and everything else works, but I'm in it to win it. And then as you get to know my stories and my podcast, join the Patreon at some point because I'm teaching a lot on storytelling. I'm going to share a lot on podcasting, but I'm very accessible in helping people in those areas as well.
How can people find you online and social media?
I'm at Shannon Cason, so I always jump on and get at Shannon Cason immediately when they got a new social media platform. YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and I'm doing these short little stories. I love doing it too because I take my longer stories and I have to make them into a 60-second story, and I like the challenge of that. And if I can
Yeah.
bring a mood and a feeling and give you some little texture of a scene in that time frame. And I think I hit it a few times, and I'm keeping those coming too, giving snippets of the podcast as well. But I do some original 60-second stories. I did some on Rent-A-Center. I had a job at Rent-A-Center, and it seemed like people like those a lot too.
All right. So, man, listen, I appreciate you jumping on this with me and for your time. And again, I've been admiring you for quite some time. Storyteller to storyteller, you're one of my favorites. And to get this opportunity to sit with you and learn a little bit more about your why has been a true honor for me. So I appreciate you.
Appreciate you. Much love to you. Much success. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You too, man.